Thank you very much, Rakesh, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. We're coming to the tail end of the conference, and those of you who watch cricket know that generally the team captain puts on the big hitters at the beginning, and we definitely had a big hitter with the Prime Minister kicking off the game and giving us a great start. But sometimes you have a few surprising tail-enders also, who you might throw out a couple of surprising hits and win the game. And
win the match.
Yeah, maybe I'll throw a couple of surprising hits here. I'm going to look at a couple of new approaches, or newish approaches, and a couple of key constituencies. And I have to be pretty brief about it because we don't have much time. I'll look a little bit at humanitarian framework, and that's already been mentioned, but I think there's a bit more that can be said. I want to follow up on some of the ideas that have been talked about on no first use, prohibition of use, and where there might be some opportunities to take that forward. I want to highlight some of the opportunities that emerged in the Openended working group, and then I'll look at a couple of the constituencies that are elevating. We've already heard Red Cross as one of them, but I'll focus just a little bit on parliamentarians and on religious and faith-based communities. On the humanitarian framework, this is a very important framework, as we've heard a number of speakers on, in terms of elevating the imperative for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And it's elevating both the political and the legal imperative for such elimination. And we saw this to some considerable degree in the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, the case on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, because it's primarily based on the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons that the court determined that the use of nuclear weapons is generally illegal, because they would hardly be reconcilable with the humanitarian laws of warfare. The court, for example, said that the destructive effects of nuclear weapons cannot be contained in time or space, and that this make them uniquely destructive. That language came from the presentations to the court from the Marshall Islands, directly coming out of the experience from the humanitarian and environmental consequences of the nuclear tests. The court also looked at peace and security law, so it wasn't just on the use of nuclear weapons, but also the threat or use. And then it concluded an unconditional obligation to pursue negotiations to achieve complete nuclear disarmament. And that was not primarily a treaty-based obligation, although it did refer to the NPT, but it's derived more from customary law. So therefore that obligation applies universally to states whether or not the parties to the NPT and across the board. So the humanitarian consequences was a very strong driver in coming to this conclusion on the illegality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons and the obligation to achieve nuclear disarmament. But then the impact of that is modified somewhat by other considerations. And we see this particularly in the case of India. India put forward an incredibly strong statement to the International Court of Justice on the illegality of the use of nuclear weapons, not just the first use, but also retaliatory use, and therefore also the threat of use. And it even went on to say if the threat of use of nuclear weapons is illegal, then so too is the possession. And India went on to endorse the follow-up resolution at the United Nations General Assembly calling for negotiations on a nuclear weapons convention. And yet 2 years later tested nuclear weapons and declared themselves a nuclear armed state. When Jaswant Singh was asked this at the United Nations, how can you reconcile, the testing of nuclear weapons with the position that you put to the International Court of Justice? He said, India has to move from idealism to realism. So what's that inferring? Well, you may have the law on the side of elimination of nuclear weapons based on the humanitarian consequences, but in the real world there are security issues which have to be dealt with, and that is not answered by the humanitarian consequences framework. The security reasons, or the other reasons, or the drivers that Patricia Lewis talked about that give rise to countries acquiring or holding onto nuclear weapons, those are not addressed completely by the Humanitarian Consequences Framework, even if the Humanitarian Consequences Framework elevates the political and the legal imperative. Moving on to some of the ideas which Manpreet Sethi put forward on no first use and non-use. I thought these were very interesting and very pertinent. And also in terms of that moving on no first use and non-use is very important in order to ensure a more strategic stability if you're lowering numbers. If you're just lowering numbers without changing doctrine, that could create instability. I think there were some very important points there. Now, India, of course, has put forward the UN resolution calling for the negotiations of a convention on non-use of nuclear weapons, and it gets a degree of support every year, but it's primarily the non-aligned movement that supports. I think that there might be opportunities now with this Humanitarian Consequences Framework to come forward with a new resolution based pretty much on the one that's there at the moment, but with a new grouping of countries. And that is the grouping of countries that's coming around behind the Humanitarian Consequences Framework. Because the Humanitarian Consequences Framework points directly to the non-use of nuclear weapons because of the consequences of them. Now, could India do that? There has been some suspicion from some of the states involved in the Humanitarian Consequences Framework, particularly because they saw India supported the case in the World Court and then 2 years later went and tested nuclear weapons. But perhaps if India paid more attention and not paid more attention, but moved one step forward on humanitarian consequences and joined the joint statement on humanitarian consequences, that might help build the relationship with those countries in order to move towards a better supported UN General Assembly resolution. India has already demonstrated good faith by participating in the humanitarian consequences conferences, so there could be a possibility for doing that. But that's working mostly with the non-nuclear states. Are there any openings to moving on this issue with the nuclear weapon states? Well, I would say there possibly is. And that's where, and I saw the Prime Minister raise this in his speech, where he talked not just about no first use, but also about the idea of sole purpose. And sole purpose was put forward Japan's put forward actually the idea of sole purpose in the lead up to the nuclear posture review with a letter from the Foreign Minister to the Secretary of State to suggest that perhaps that's somewhere where the United States could go. And then we saw in the nuclear posture review that it indicated that the primary purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter other nuclear weapons, with the commitment to move towards sole purpose. So perhaps that gives an entry for India and China, that already has a no first use policy, to work with particularly the United States, and that might help them bring in the other nuclear armed or nuclear possessing states, or maybe a joint statement on sole purpose, and that can help pave the way then towards a prohibition of use of nuclear weapons. The other opening also comes from the US Nuclear Posture Review, where President Obama affirmed the practice of non-use of nuclear weapons. Now that's not exactly the same as sole purpose, but it provides another opening. Maybe there is a possibility through the Security Council to get a much stronger affirmation of the practice of non-use of nuclear weapons, and that might help also provide a step towards moving towards prohibition at some stage. So that's on the no-use prohibition of use. I want to move to the open-ended working group now, because this is moving towards taking forward multilateral negotiations. That was the purpose that the open-ended working group was established by the United Nations General Assembly, on seeing that there was blocks to taking forward multilateral negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament, but not wanting to remove it from the Conference on Disarmament totally. So providing some sort of forum that could feed into the Conference on Disarmament. And that's exactly what the open-ended working group did. It looked at a range of approaches to multilateral negotiations. The approaches included step-by-step, a comprehensive, a prohibition approach by non-nuclear weapon states, or a building blocks approach. And I don't have time to go into those four approaches, and they're not mutually exclusive. in any case. But these were discussed in the open-ended working group, and it was discussed in a manner of like mutual respect and exploration, as opposed to just countries putting forward statements and trying to convince others to sign on to their statements. So it emerged from there that there was a consensus report. And the consensus report was then delivered to the UN General Assembly, which adopted a resolution. Over 150 countries supported the resolution. That called on the Conference on Disarmament and the Disarmament Commission to take up the ideas from the open-ended working group, and then after a year there would be a review to see whether the open-ended working group should be revised and taken further work, or whether some of these ideas were actually being taken up. So we have an opportunity here now to review the progress that's been taken in the Conference on Disarmament, Disarmament Commission and other UN fora, to report back to the General Assembly this year and then take a decision. If there isn't progress on multilateral nuclear disarmament that is sufficient and moving things forward in a genuine way, then further work could be undertaken by the open-ended working group. And there's a particular task that was raised, an area where further work could be undertaken by the open-ended working group that was raised by Sweden and New Zealand and supported by others in that. And that was to explore further the roles that are currently ascribed to nuclear weapons. What might be alternative ways of meeting those security roles for nuclear weapons, helping to look towards security in a world without nuclear weapons and to phase out the role of nuclear weapons in order to facilitate negotiations. So this is an area where further study could be taken and further development, and it's an area where that work can be done by both non-nuclear states, those who have either never ascribed to nuclear weapons or had nuclear weapons or are under the role of nuclear weapons but gave it up. And what was it and how is it that they can achieve security without nuclear weapons? Can that help those with nuclear weapons to also move in that direction? So that's some areas. Finally, coming to constituencies. There are a range of constituencies which are very important. I'm focusing mostly on parliamentarians and religious communities because they are the ones that I've been working with quite closely over the past few years. Parliamentarians, I'm working with a global network of parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. As a global network of parliamentarians across the political parties around the world in nuclear weapon states, nuclear armed states, allied states, and non-nuclear states. They have been elevating these issues, including humanitarian framework, including cooperative security mechanisms, in a range of fora in their own national parliaments, in regional parliaments and interparliamentary organisations, and then bringing that to the United Nations itself. One example of the interaction, when the UN Secretary General put out his 5-point plan, this was something which was a comprehensive approach. It could see the combination of steps and measures at the same time as working on a more comprehensive approach. It had elements that could be picked up in the range of parliaments, whether you're in the nuclear weapon states, allies, or non-nuclear states. So many parliaments followed up by adopting resolutions supporting the UN Secretary General's plan, and so did many of those parliaments took it to the Interparliamentary Union, 164 parliaments, including most of the nuclear armed states, and got a resolution supporting the UN Secretary General's plan. And so that then gave a much greater elevation of that leading into the 2010 NPT review conference, and I think was one of the factors that helped get that commitment in the NPT review conference that all states should make special efforts to build the framework for a nuclear weapons-free world, noting the UN Secretary General's plan, the Nuclear Weapons Convention, and the framework of agreements. I can't mention much more of the details except to say there's been a follow-up resolution by the Interparliamentary Union that was just adopted last month, and that is how the parliamentarians can now implement some of these decisions, like the 2010 NPT review decision, the UN Secretary General's plan, etc. It gives us an opportunity to work with the parliaments on advancing these issues. So too has the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, with a particular focus on the cooperative security framework that will help facilitate a nuclear weapons-free world. Finally, on religious communities, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon made a particular comment on the fact that most people, a majority of people in the world, do belong to some sort of religious faith. And that provides some sort of moral, ethical guidance in how they participate in world activities. And the Religions for Peace has just released a resource guide for the religious and faith-based communities, which looks at the values and of the range of different religious and faith-based communities, the comments that have come from them on nuclear disarmament, and how they can engage more proactively in supporting key multilateral efforts to achieve a nuclear weapons-free world. So it gives us a great opportunity to work with a huge constituency that may need, some of them may need some more information, but they have the basic core values to be able to move ahead of that. So I thank you very much. I apologise if I took a little bit more over the 10 minutes, and I look forward to any discussion.